On the morning of April 15th, 1945, in the center of a Dutch city called Groningen, a Canadian sergeant crouched behind a stone fountain in the middle of the Grote Markt and watched a white flag come back through the smoke. It had gone out 90 seconds earlier, tied to a broom handle, carried across the square by a Canadian officer under his hand. The officer had walked to the front of a 4-story stone building in the northwest corner of the square. He had knocked, in French and in German, on the barricaded door. He had read out the third request for surrender that his battalion had made to the men inside that building since the sun had come up. The white flag came back with a rifle bullet through it. The sergeant behind the fountain did not swear. He had been in Europe for 11 months. He had learned by then that swearing did not help. He turned to the corporal beside him and said one sentence quietly in the French of a man who had grown up in the working class East End of Montreal. Amenez la Wasp, bring up the Wasp. If you had a father, an uncle, a grandfather who served with the Canadian Army in the last month of the war in Europe, this is one of the mornings he might have carried home with him and might never have described. Even to you, the war was 3 weeks from ending. Everyone in the square knew it. Everyone in the building on the northwest corner knew it. By the time the smoke cleared 4 days later, 43 Canadians would be dead in the streets of a Dutch city most of their families had never heard of, and 110 civilians would be dead in the cellars and the second-floor apartments they had thought were safe. And in a stone building on the northwest corner of the Grote Markt, a German major had already decided he was going to die that morning, rather than walk out with his hands up. What his choice cost the men in the building with him, and what it cost a piece of the city around him, is the story this is really about. By the second week of April 1945, every soldier in the 1st Canadian Army knew the war in Europe had less than a month left to run. Every soldier in the German Army knew it too. The American 9th Army was across the Elbe. The British 2nd Army was closing on Hamburg. The Soviets were fighting street to street inside the outer suburbs of Berlin. Everyone with a map understood what was coming. The men in the 4-story stone building on the northwest corner of the Grote Markt in Groningen understood it as clearly as anyone. What they were choosing to do about it was another matter. The city itself sat about 60 kilometers west of the German border, in the flat northern reaches of the Netherlands. Groningen was the largest city in the northern half of the country. Population in the spring of 1945 was somewhere between 120 and 130,000. It was a university town. It was a market town. It was, on paper, the kind of place armies of that period usually tried to avoid fighting through, because fighting through cities meant killing civilians, and everyone knew it. The Canadian officer who arrived outside Groningen on the 12th of April 1945, and who would spend the next 4 days deciding how to take the city back from the Germans holding it, was a major general named Bruce Matthews. He was the youngest man to command a division in the Canadian Army during the entire Second World War. He had been in continuous command of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division since the previous November. Matthews did not look like a general officer. He was slim, quiet. He wore steel-rimmed glasses that made him look, in some of the photographs of him from that spring, like a schoolteacher who had wandered into the wrong uniform. His voice when he gave orders was low. He almost never raised it. Men who served under him remembered later that they had trusted him, because he was one of the few senior officers they had met who seemed to weigh a decision before he made it, rather than after. He was not a career soldier by background. Before the war, he had worked in his family's business in Toronto. He had joined the militia in the 1920s because his father had been an artillery officer in the First World War and had wanted his son to know the trade. Matthews had risen through the reserve force in the years between the wars. When the Second World War came, he had gone active. He had commanded an artillery regiment in England. then a brigade. Then, at the age of 35, an entire division. 35 is a young age to command a division in any army. In the Canadian Army in the last year of the Second World War, it was almost unprecedented. Most divisional commanders on both sides of the war were in their late 40s and early 50s. Some of the German Corps commanders his division was fighting were in their 60s. Matthews was young enough to be the son of some of the men whose armies he was pushing back across Northern Europe. The men who worked with him closely used a phrase, quietly, when his name came up. They said Matthews was a soldier's soldier, which was their way of saying that he never asked his men to do anything he would not have done himself. Working directly under him at Groningen was another officer worth naming, Brigadier William J. McGill, commander of the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade. McGill was in his early 40s. He had been a professional soldier since before the war. He was a harder-edged man than Matthews. Direct, impatient with staff work. He preferred to be forward with the battalions when a fight was on, and in the fight for Groningen he would be. Inside McGill's brigade were 3 infantry battalions that would carry most of the actual weight of the city fighting to come. The Black Watch, Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, from Montreal. Highlanders in kilts and khaki, with a regimental pipe band that could still, at the right moment, put the hair up on the back of a man's neck. The Calgary Highlanders from Alberta. Prairie men, farmers, ranchers, the sons of men who had homesteaded the Canadian West a generation earlier. Most of them had never seen a European city until they landed in Britain in 1941 or 1942. By 1945, they had seen a great many of them, not usually under conditions that let them appreciate the architecture. And the Régiment de Maisonneuve, a French-speaking battalion from Montreal, Quebec. Its commanding officer at Groningen was Lieutenant Colonel Julien Bibeau. Bibeau was in his mid-30s. Quiet, precise, he had commanded the battalion since the previous summer. His men called him Le Colonel and meant it as a compliment, because he had earned the way they said the word. The Maisonneuve was one of 2 French-speaking infantry battalions that had come across from Canada with the 2nd Division. Its officers gave their orders in French. Its NCOs shouted them in French. Its men swore in French, prayed in French, and, when the fighting got very close, occasionally, when there was no time to think, cried out for their mothers in French. They were, by 1945, part of the same larger Anglo-Canadian machine that had sent them, but the language they carried the war in was not English. It was the working-class French of Montreal and the small farm villages of rural Quebec. The other Canadian brigades of the 2nd Division were there as well. The 4th Brigade with the Royal Regiment of Canada from Toronto. The 6th Brigade with the Fusiliers Mont-Royal, another French-speaking Montreal battalion. And in support, from divisional and corps troops, the Toronto Scottish Regiment with its Wasp flamethrower carriers, and squadrons of Sherman tanks from the Fort Garry Horse, the armored regiment attached to 2nd Division for the coming fight. On the other side of the line, inside Groningen, the German force waiting for them was harder to describe with precision. Not because the records are missing, because the force itself was patchwork. There was no elite German division holding Groningen in April of 1945. There was no equivalent of the Waffen-SS Panzer divisions that had held Caen the year before, or the paratrooper regiments that had held Ortona the winter before that. What was left in the Netherlands in the last month of the war was what the German army could scrape together after 5 years of continuous attrition, after Normandy, after the Ardennes, after the Rhine crossing. And that meant, in practical terms, a camp group, a battle group, improvised, mixed, made up of whatever units happened to be inside the city when the Canadians arrived. Naval troops from Kriegsmarine units pulled off submarine bases along the North Sea coast and handed rifles. Marine Schutzen, Marines in name only, older Landesschützen, home defense reservists too old for frontline service in 1939, still in uniform now because Germany had run out of men, a stiffening of SS men, some of them true believers, some of them just men who had joined the wrong organization at the wrong point in their lives, and, along with them, Dutch collaborators, members of the Dutch Nazi movement, the Nationaal Socialistische Beweging, the NSB, members of the paramilitary Landwacht Nederland, men whose neighbors in the coming days would want them dead. The most senior German officer inside Groningen when the Canadians arrived was, according to the surviving Canadian intelligence estimates, a colonel commanding a Kampfgruppe of about 3,300 men. His name does not survive with certainty in any English-language source I have been able to verify. Some German documents from the last weeks of the war are simply missing. Others survive only in fragmentary form. What is certain is that the German command structure inside the city was not unified. Different pockets of resistance would answer, in the coming days, to different officers. Some of those officers would surrender when the situation became hopeless. Some would not. One of the ones who would not was a German major, whose name I also cannot give you with certainty, holed up with roughly 40 men in a stone building on the northwest corner of the Grote Markt, the main square of the old city. The Canadians who came for him did not know his name either. What they knew was that he had a machine gun position covering the south face of the square. He had riflemen at the windows of the upper floors. He had, by every practical calculation, no reasonable prospect of being reinforced, resupplied, or relieved. He had less than 4 weeks of war left ahead of him, no matter what he did. And when the first white flag went up out of the square on the morning of the 15th of April, he ordered his men to fire on it. That was the man Lieutenant Colonel Julien Bibot's Régiment de Maisonneuve on that particular morning was going to have to deal with, and what they would do to deal with him, and what would happen to a piece of the Grote Markt as a result, is the story this is really about. Before we walk into it, there is one more thing worth saying about the men who fought for Groningen that week. They were, most of them, not much older than the men holding the buildings against them. On both sides, in April of 1945, the average infantry soldier was somewhere between 19 and 23. Some of the German troops were younger. Some of the Dutch collaborators were older, because political violence in the Netherlands had drawn in men who would never have been drafted into a normal army. The Canadians were a broader mix. Some had been in Europe since Sicily in 1943. Some had come across from Britain only in the last month. A few, in the reinforcement drafts of early 1945, had been in uniform for less than 6 months. The reinforcement problem in the Canadian Army by the spring of 1945 was severe enough that some of the young men going into their first serious action at Groningen had received only weeks of infantry training before being pushed into a battalion at the front. They died at higher rates than the veterans. It was one of the quiet arithmetic realities of the last months of the war. A private who had been in the Army for a year had learned things. A private who had been in the Army for 4 months had not. And those things kept the first man alive in situations that killed the second one. The veterans knew this. They took care of the new men when they could. They did not always have the chance. By the time they reached the outskirts of Groningen, on the 12th of April, 1945, none of them, on either side, was talking about the war ending soon. They had learned by then not to. Talking about the end of a war you might not personally survive was a form of bad luck no one wanted to invite. They just kept doing the work. Groningen, in the spring of 1945, was one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the Low Countries. Founded in the 11th century, a trading town for most of its history, a university town since 1614, when the University of Groningen was chartered. By the 20th century, it had grown into the commercial and administrative capital of the northern Netherlands. Population in April of 1945 was somewhere between 120 and 130,000, depending on which source you trust. The heart of it was, and still is, the Grote Markt. Grote Markt means, in Dutch, the Great Market. It is a rectangular open square in the middle of the old city, roughly 120 meters long on its longer axis, about 80 meters across, cobbled, bordered on every side by tall narrow stone and brick buildings, 4 and 5 stories high, most of them dating from the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. Merchants' houses, guild halls, cafes. In peacetime, the square held an open-air market on Tuesdays and Fridays that had been running in one form or another for 600 years. The buildings that lined the square in April of 1945 were, most of them, older than the country the Canadian soldiers had come from. Some of them predated Confederation by more than 200 years. Some of them predated Champlain landing at Quebec. The oldest of them predated the first European explorers to reach the Canadian coast. They had stood on that square through wars against Spain, wars against France, wars between rival German states, wars against Napoleon. They had been rebuilt sometimes, after fires and after floods. They had never been rebuilt after being fought over by a modern mechanized army with high explosive artillery and flamethrower carriers. That was going to be a first for most of them. On the eastern edge of the Grote Markt rose the Martinikerk, the Church of St. Martin, a late medieval Protestant church, its main structure in place since the 15th century. Attached to it, standing free, was the tower, the Martinitoren, 97 meters tall, the tallest structure in the northern Netherlands, built between 1469 and 1482 in the classic red brick Gothic style of the Baltic and North Sea trading world. On a clear day, from the top of the Martinitoren, you could see 30 kilometers in every direction, which meant that in April of 1945, the German observers up in that tower could see almost every road along which the Canadian Army was moving toward them. Everyone in the Canadian command understood that the Martinitoren was a problem. Everyone also understood what happened when a modern army destroyed a medieval Dutch church tower in a war of liberation. Matthews decided, quietly, that the Martinitoren would come through the fight standing. The rest of the old city was a labyrinth. Narrow, cobbled streets, most of them no more than 4 or 5 meters wide, sometimes narrower, buildings pressed shoulder to shoulder along their entire length. Interior courtyards, cellars beneath cellars, some of them going back to the medieval foundations. In a city like that, a defender with a machine gun in a second-story window could hold up an infantry company for hours. A defender with a machine gun on both sides of the street could hold one up all day. The Canadian officers who had studied the aerial photographs of Groningen in the days before the assault understood what they were looking at. They had seen it before, at Ortona in Italy 15 months earlier. They had seen it from the outside in the ruined cities of Normandy the summer before. They had heard from British and American colleagues about Caen, about Aachen, about Cassino. A medieval European town was, in the age of the automatic rifle and the shaped charge, a natural fortress. Around the old city ran a ring of canals, the Rijtdiep, cutting northwest toward the sea, the Van Starkenborg Canal, a modern shipping canal to the north, the Verbindingscanal to the south, older waterways, cutting through the interior of the town as well, some of them going back to the medieval walls. Every canal was crossed by bridges, and in the days before the Canadians arrived, German engineers had gone through the city and had wired those bridges to blow. They had succeeded, in the end, in destroying about 5 of the main bridges. 5 of them, for one reason or another, they did not manage to blow before the Canadians arrived. Some of those failures would matter enormously in the days ahead. A bridge that stays standing when your engineers intended to drop it into a canal is worth, in city fighting, several rifle companies. Every intact bridge the Canadians found in the coming days was one they did not have to cross a canal under fire to replace. The weather was going to be with the Canadians for most of the fight, in a modest way. The morning of the 13th of April, 1945, opened cool. Overnight low around 3 degrees Celsius. Day would climb to about 11. Light rain in the morning, clearing by afternoon. The ground was firm, though the low pastures outside the city were still soft from the winter thaw. Visibility during daylight was reasonable, 3 to 5 kilometers under the low cloud that hung over most of the northern Netherlands that week, which meant, in practical terms, that when the Canadians began pushing into the city, on the morning of the 13th, the Germans in the tower could watch them coming. But no Allied heavy bombers were going to be coming down out of a clear high blue sky. What air support the Canadians had over Groningen that week was tactical. Typhoon fighter bombers of 2nd Tactical Air Force, working in close support, rockets and cannon on identified strongpoints. Nothing that would flatten a whole city block. That restraint was not accidental. Matthews had decided, before the fight began, that Groningen would not be destroyed to be liberated, which was a decision easier to make in a briefing tent than to keep once his infantry began taking casualties in the streets. But he made it, and he held to it. And it shaped almost every tactical choice that would be made over the next 4 days. He would not use his medium artillery to shell the city center. He would not call in heavy bombers on the Old Town. He would fight it, if he had to fight it at all, at the pace and the price of infantry moving from one door to the next. He would use the flamethrowers of the Toronto Scottish and the tanks of the Fort Garry Horse and the anti-tank guns of his own brigades, sparingly and specifically, aimed at particular buildings where particular enemies were making him pay. Every officer under him understood what that meant. It meant that the price of not destroying Groningen would be paid in Canadian casualties, higher than they might otherwise have been, higher than they would have been if he had been willing to reduce a stubborn city block to rubble. He was not willing. It is worth pausing on that for a moment, because it is one of the things that made this small forgotten battle different from the larger, more famous city fights of the same period. Berlin, the same month, was being reduced house by house, block by block, to smoking rubble by Soviet artillery and Soviet air power. Manila had been methodically flattened by American bombardment 2 months earlier in a fight that killed something on the order of 100,000 Filipino civilians. Warsaw, the year before, had been deliberately razed to the ground by the Germans as an act of state policy. That was the standard, by 1945, for a city that changed hands under fire. Groningen did not go that way, not because the Canadians could not have flattened it. They had the firepower, not because the Germans were less determined than the defenders of Berlin. Some of them were as determined as any defenders in the war. Groningen did not go that way because one particular Canadian general, standing at his divisional headquarters south of the city on the morning of the 13th of April, 1945, decided it would not. The German commander inside the city had made a different calculation. The Kampfgruppe holding Groningen had roughly 3,300 men, compared to the 20,000 and more of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division moving on them. That was a hopeless mathematical position. 6 to 1. In an urban defense against an army that intended not to use its heaviest weapons, that ratio was more survivable than it looked on paper. In cities, defenders always have an advantage. A German rifleman with a Panzerfaust in a 4th-floor window can, on a good day, destroy a tank worth 100 times his own weight. Machine guns in interlocking positions can turn a single cobbled street into a killing ground for an infantry company. Whether the German commander believed his men could actually hold Groningen against the 2nd Division is impossible to say from the surviving records. What he certainly understood was that his orders from higher headquarters, orders that had by that point in the war become both ideological and detached from reality, told him to fight. Standing orders from Berlin, radioed out to what was left of the German army in the Netherlands that spring, demanded resistance to the last cartridge in every fortified place. The men in the buildings around the Grote Markt would, in the coming days, interpret those orders in different ways. Some pockets would fight for a few hours, and then, when their officers judged the position hopeless, would put out white flags and come out with their hands up. Some pockets would hold longer. Some would fight until their buildings were on fire around them. That is the ground the fight was going to happen on. And those were the choices, on both sides, that were going to have to be made on it. The Dutch civilians who lived in that ground could not really do anything about any of it. Some had left the city in the previous weeks, moving out to villages further north or west, staying with relatives, sleeping in barns. Many, perhaps most, could not leave. They stayed. They took their families down into their cellars. They laid mattresses on the stone floors. They filled every container they had with water. They rationed what food they had, and they waited, in the dark, for the war to arrive at the front door of their own street. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes over a civilian population after 5 years of foreign occupation. The Dutch civilians of Groningen in April of 1945 had lived through that occupation from the 10th of May, 1940, until the day the Canadians came. Almost 5 years to the day. They had watched their Jewish neighbors disappear onto trains in 1942 and 1943. Most of those neighbors had not come back. They had watched their sons dodge German labor drafts. They had watched their food supply shrink through the terrible hunger winter of 1944 and 1945, when the western provinces of the Netherlands had, in some cases, been reduced to eating tulip bulbs to stay alive. They had watched their Dutch police forces be partly co-opted by the Nazi occupation and partly, quietly, undermined from within by resistance networks whose members changed identities every few months. By April of 1945, they were, most of them, at the far end of everything a civilian population can be asked to endure, and they were about to be asked to endure 4 more days. Between the 12th and the 16th of April, 1945, the war did arrive, and when it left, 4 days later, more than 100 of them would be dead. In a city they had not asked to have liberated the way it was liberated. From an occupation they had not asked to have imposed on them in the first place. 5 years earlier, that was the ground. That was the geography. That was the argument the coming days were going to settle. Bruce Matthews issued his orders for the attack on the afternoon of the 12th of April, 1945. The 5th Brigade would strike from the south. The 4th Brigade would come in from the east. The 6th Brigade would move against the western approaches. Reconnaissance elements would push toward the ring of canals overnight. The main assault would begin at first light on the 13th. Julien Bibeau, at his own battalion headquarters, gathered his company commanders that same afternoon. He spoke to them in French. He was, according to men who were there, calm. He was almost always calm. He walked them through the routes his companies would take through the southern approaches to the city. He told them what to expect from the German defense. He told them what he expected from his men. There is no record of what he said in the last minute or two of that briefing. That has come down through the histories with certainty. But every battalion commander in every army in that war ended a briefing before a city fight with some version of the same thought. Kill the enemy where you find him. Do not kill anyone else if you can possibly help it. Keep your men alive. Come back with as many of them as you can. The Régiment de Maisonneuve went to sleep that night in ditches and orchards south of Groningen. Some of them slept. Some of them did not. The ones who did not sleep smoked. They smoked the cigarettes that Canadian rations issued. Sweet Caporals, Players. Occasionally, an American brand that had come across through the Lend-Lease supply line. The smoke drifted up from the ditches in small blue clouds, and the sentries who saw it, on both sides, understood that a man's need for a cigarette in the last few hours, before a city fight, was one of the few things left in the war that both sides could still recognize in each other. The morning of the 13th of April, 1945, would be gray and cool, with a light rain that stopped by mid-morning. By the time the sun cleared the cloud, the 5th Brigade would already be across its first canal, taking its first prisoners and taking its first casualties. And in a stone building on the northwest corner of the Grote Markt, a German major and about 40 men would be checking their weapons, opening their spare ammunition, and making sure their fields of fire covered every approach to their door. 2 full days would pass before those two forces met each other face to face. Everything that happened in between is what turned Groningen from a name on a map into a place a specific group of Canadian veterans, for the rest of their lives, would never talk about with anyone who had not been there. The first light on the 13th of April, 1945, came up cold and gray over the flat farmland south of Groningen. The rain had stopped an hour before dawn. The ground was damp. The men of the Régiment de Maisonneuve crouched in the ditches along the roads running north into the city. From the direction of Hoogzand, could smell wet earth and diesel, and, faintly, from somewhere behind them, the coffee that the battalion cooks had brewed up in the darkness. They moved off at 5:30 in the morning. The first contact came before 6. A German outpost in a farmhouse about a kilometer south of the city outskirts, 2 riflemen, and a machine gunner. The lead platoon of the Maisonneuve went into the ditch on the west side of the road when the first burst came in. Their platoon commander, a young lieutenant, worked one section wide right through a hedge and a plowed field. In 11 minutes it was over. The German machine gunner dead in the doorway. The 2 riflemen alive, hands up, being walked back to the rear by a Canadian corporal who did not speak German and did not need to. The Maisonneuve kept moving. By 7 in the morning, they were at the first canal. The German engineers who had wired that particular bridge had done their work carelessly, in a hurry, and one of the charges had failed to detonate when the wire was pulled. The bridge was still standing. A pioneer section from the battalion went across it at a run, cut the visible wires, and pulled 2 remaining charges off the underside of the roadway. By 7:30, the lead companies of the Maisonneuve were across the canal and pushing into the southern suburbs of Groningen. That was where the war changed, because up until that canal, the fight had been a country fight. Ditches, hedges, farmhouses, the kind of fighting Canadian infantry had been doing for the better part of a year, ever since they had come off the beaches in Normandy. What lay north of the canal was different. It was a city, and a city for an infantryman was a different kind of animal. The first main street they entered was called the Herweg. It ran straight north into the heart of the old city, all the way to the Grote Markt. 4-story buildings on both sides, trees along the sidewalks, streetcar tracks in the cobblestones, Dutch flags in some of the windows. In one of them, a woman was leaning out and waving a small cloth to them. In another, 3 streets further up, a German rifleman was watching them come and choosing his moment. Every man in the lead company of the Maisonneuve understood what a city fight was going to cost. They had heard the stories from the men who had done Ortona the winter before last. They had heard the stories from the American units who had done Aachen the previous autumn. They knew. You did not run down the street. You went along the walls, one man at a time, fast between doorways. The man behind covering the windows above. The man behind him covering the windows above and behind. You did not bunch up. You did not stop in the open. When you had to cross a street, you did it in a rush, one man at a time, everyone else watching every window on the far side. If a machine gun opened on you, you did not turn and run. You went to ground. You called for the Bren gun. The Bren gunner put a burst into the window. You called for the section grenadier. The grenadier threw a Mills bomb into the room the gun had come from. And then 2 men went in the door and up the stairs and finished the job with rifles and bayonets. That was how you took a city, door by door, room by room, every mistake costing a man. The Maisonneuve did it that way, along the Herweg, all through the daylight hours of the 13th of April, 1945. There is a particular exhaustion that settles into an infantryman during a day of city fighting that is different from anything else in war. It is not the exhaustion of a march. It is not the exhaustion of a firefight in the open. It is the exhaustion of constant vigilance in 3 dimensions. Every window is a threat. Every doorway is a threat. Every rooftop is a threat. Every basement window at your feet is a threat. Your eyes never stop moving. Your hands never leave your weapon. And the muscles in your shoulders and your neck and your lower back tighten by imperceptible degrees, hour by hour, until by evening you can barely turn your head. The men of the Maisonneuve knew, by the middle of the afternoon on the 13th, that they had 2 more days of this at least, and probably 3. And they kept moving. By nightfall, the lead companies had advanced perhaps 800 meters into the southern part of the old city. They had lost, that day, 4 men killed and 11 wounded. It was not a catastrophic day by the standards of an infantry battalion in Northwest Europe in the last year of the war. It was, by those standards, an ordinary day, which was itself a comment on what those standards had become. Behind them, the Black Watch and the Calgary Highlanders were doing the same work along parallel streets. To their east, elements of the Royal Regiment of Canada were pushing in from the east side of the city. Progress was steady, not fast, steady. At around 5 in the afternoon, the sun came out. For about an hour, the wet slate roofs of Groningen glittered in the low April light. Then the cloud closed in again, and the temperature began to drop toward the freezing that would come after dark. The Canadians dug in where they were and settled in for the night. They did not sleep much. Sniping continued in the darkness from 2nd and 3rd floor windows on both sides of the lines. Small parties of Germans, dropped off in the confusion of the day's fighting, worked back through the streets in the small hours of the morning, sometimes escaping north, sometimes running into Canadian sentries and dying in short, sharp exchanges of fire. Nobody on either side got much rest that night. In the cellars of the southern part of the city, Dutch families listened to the sound of Canadian voices in the street above them, and, for the first time in almost 5 years, dared to hope. Some of them opened their doors to Canadian soldiers passing by and offered them bread. Some of them offered them the last of a bottle of Genever that had been hidden in a cellar wall since 1940. A few of them, older women mostly, wept and put their hands on the shoulders of young Canadian boys who reminded them of their own sons who had gone into the German labor drafts and had not come back and might never come back. The Canadian boys, most of whom were in their early 20s and had not been kissed by a European civilian since the last village on the way in, did not always know what to do about the crying old women. They stood there, awkwardly, with the weight of a Bren gun in their hands, and let themselves be touched. Then they moved on, because there was still a city to take. The morning of the 14th of April opened without rain, slightly warmer. The Maisonneuve moved off again at first light. So did every other Canadian battalion in the city. That day was harder than the first. The Germans had pulled back into the old core of the city overnight. They had abandoned the outer streets and had concentrated in the tall stone buildings around the Grote Markt, along the main shopping streets, and around a few specific strongpoints that they had prepared in advance. The advance now was slower. Each block cost more. Each door was more likely to be defended. The Toronto Scottish brought up their Wasp flamethrower carriers. The Wasp was a horrible weapon. There is no honest way to describe it that softens what it actually did. It was a small tracked vehicle the size of a family car, with a flame projector mounted on the front. It could throw a jet of burning fuel up to about 100 yards. When it fired, it did not just set the target on fire. It coated the target with sticky liquid fuel that continued to burn on any surface it touched. For as long as the fuel lasted, it burned brick, it burned stone, it burned steel, it burned the air itself, in a fireball that sucked the oxygen out of a room and could kill men in the next room over by suffocation alone. The Canadian Army in Northwest Europe used Wasps sparingly. They were not a weapon anyone was proud of using. They were used, mostly, when a specific German strongpoint had proven impossible to reduce any other way, and when trying to reduce it any other way was going to cost more Canadian lives than the officer, on the spot, was prepared to spend. In Groningen, on the 14th of April, 1945, and again, on the 15th, the Wasps came out more than any Canadian officer would have wanted, because a certain kind of German defender, in a certain kind of stone building, could not be dug out with rifle grenades and Bren gunfire, could not be dug out with the light anti-tank guns the infantry battalions carried with them, could sometimes be dug out with a Sherman tank at close range, firing high explosive rounds through the windows, but only if the tank could actually get within firing range of the building without being killed by a Panzerfaust from a window it had not spotted. When none of those worked, the Wasps came up. By the middle of the afternoon on the 14th, the Maisonneuve was clearing a set of shops along the Gedempte Zuiderdiep, one of the main streets running east and west across the southern edge of the old city. A germ section had turned a tobacconist's shop into a strongpoint. The doors and lower windows were sandbagged from the inside. There was an MG-42 in the second-story window, covering the whole width of the street. 2 attempts by lead sections of the Maisonneuve to get across the intersection had been driven back, with 3 men killed and 5 wounded, over a distance of about 8 meters of cobblestone. The company commander called for a Wasp. The Wasp came up along the side of the street, keeping close to the walls. When it reached the intersection, it turned. The commander of the carrier fired one long burst of flame directly into the ground floor of the tobacconist's shop. The building went up like a torch. 50 seconds later, a white flag came out of a second-story window. 4 German soldiers came out of the door of the shop, coughing, hands over their heads, uniforms smoking. 2 other Germans came out behind them. Then no more. Whether the rest had died from the flame, or from the smoke, or had gone out the back of the building through a courtyard, the Maisonneuve could not tell without going in. They did not go in until the flames had died down enough. When they finally did it, they found the bodies of 6 more German soldiers in the ruins of the shop. All 6 had died from asphyxiation. Their weapons had not been fired. The Canadian company commander marked the location on his map with a small red mark and moved on. He would use the Wasp 4 more times that afternoon, and more the next day. Every time he used it, some part of him did not want to use it again. Every time he did not use it, some part of him thought about the men he had already lost trying to advance without it. He was not a cruel man. Nobody in the Régiment de Maisonneuve was a cruel man, by the standards of the men who fought that war. They had all, by the spring of 1945, been shaped into something more complicated than cruelty and more complicated than mercy. They were tired. They wanted to go home. They wanted the men they were responsible for to go home too. And when a specific defender in a specific building was standing between them and both of those things, they used the tools they had. The Wasp was one of the tools. The Maisonneuve reached the southern edge of the Grote Markt at about 6 in the evening on the 14th of April, 1945. Behind them, at almost the same hour, the Fusiliers Mont Royal and the Calgary Highlanders were reaching different edges of the square, converging from the west and northwest. The Royal Regiment of Canada was closing in from the east, working past the sun flank of the Martinikerk. The Grote Markt itself was empty in the fading light. The German defense had pulled back into the buildings around it. Fires were burning in 3 separate locations along its edges. Smoke drifted up between the tall, narrow gables. Somewhere in the direction of the Martinikertoren, a spotter was probably still watching. Nobody was going to walk out into the middle of that square in daylight until the buildings around it had been cleared. Lieutenant Colonel Julien Bibeau came forward in the last of the light to look at the ground his battalion was going to have to take in the morning. He stood in the doorway of a shop halfway down the Harrestraat, one of the main streets running into the south side of the square. His radio operator crouched beside him. 2 of his company commanders stood behind him. He looked at the buildings across the square. He looked at the ones on his own side. He looked at the way the streets ran into the market at each corner, and where a defender would put a machine gun to sweep them, and where a defender might put a spotter to call fire down on any Canadian who tried to cross. He did not say much. He asked one of his company commanders a short question about the position of a specific German fire trap they had seen firing from a 4th-floor window earlier in the afternoon. His company commander answered him in 3 words. Bibeau nodded. He walked back down the street to his own headquarters in a cellar half a kilometer south to plan the morning. There is a specific quiet that comes over a city in the last hour before dark on a day of fighting. The gunfire has, mostly, stopped. The men on both sides have pulled back to whatever cover they can find. The wounded have been evacuated or, in some cases, left where they fell, because pulling them out under fire would only mean more wounded. Small fires are burning in 3 or 4 places, sending smoke straight up in the still air. Somewhere in a cellar, a child is crying, and its mother is trying, in Dutch, to comfort it. Somewhere else, an old man is dying slowly of internal injuries. No doctor is going to reach in time. Somewhere else again, in one of the buildings around the square, a young German conscript is writing a letter to his mother that he will never mail. That is the quiet Bibeau walked back through in the fading light on the 14th of April, 1945. He passed a section of his own men eating hard biscuits out of ration tins. He passed a small group of Dutch civilians who had come out of a cellar to help a Canadian stretcher party with a wounded man. He passed a burning building whose fire nobody was going to bother trying to put out until morning. He got back to his headquarters. He ate a small dinner of tinned meat and boiled cabbage. He drank a cup of coffee. He sat down at a small folding table with a map and a red pencil, and he began to plan the morning. Overnight, the Germans, in the buildings on the northwest corner of the Grote Markt, did not sleep either. Neither did the German major inside the stone building on that particular corner, whose name has not survived with certainty in any English-language source I have been able to check. He, and the roughly 40 men with him, checked their weapons, redistributed their ammunition, and moved a spare MG-42 to a window on the 3rd floor where they thought the Canadians would come from at first light. They were correct about the direction. They were correct about the time. They were wrong about almost everything else. At 6 o'clock in the morning on the 15th of April, 1945, the Régiment de Maisonneuve began its final push into the Grote Markt. 1 rifle company on the east side of the square, 1 on the west, 1 in reserve. The company commanders working from doorway to doorway, watching every window on the far side, watching every corner. The first sniper's bullet came at about 6:15 from a 4th-floor window on the far side of the square and killed a Maisonneuve corporal outright. His body was pulled back into a doorway by 2 of his own section. The section fired back. The 4th-floor window went silent. Whether they had killed the sniper or he had simply moved to another position, they did not know. They kept moving. That corporal has a name in the battalion casualty rolls. He came from a village outside Montreal. He had been in the army since 1942. He was 24 years old. His parents received the telegram 5 days later on the 20th of April, 1945, and stood in their small kitchen in the working-class east end of the city and did not speak to each other for a long time. He is buried today in the Canadian War Cemetery at Holton, in the eastern Netherlands, where about 1,400 other Canadian soldiers who fell in the last months of the war in the Low Countries are buried in neat rows. There is a photograph, if you visit that cemetery today, that you can take standing at his grave. The Dutch families in the surrounding villages still, in the 21st century, tend it. Someone puts flowers on it every year in the week around Remembrance Day. His parents are long gone now. His younger brothers are old men, and the men who saw him die over that particular strip of Dutch cobblestone at 6:15 in the morning on the 15th of April, 1945, have themselves mostly died in the years since. He is still there. By 7 in the morning, the Maisonneuve had cleared 2 of the 4 sides of the square. On the west side, working building by building, a Maisonneuve platoon under a young lieutenant reached a forestry stone building on the northwest corner. The lower windows were shuttered. The main door was barricaded from the inside. There were rifles at 2 of the upper windows. Someone inside the building fired the first burst at the platoon when its lead section was still 15 meters away. The lieutenant went to ground. His men went to ground. Nobody was hit. Somewhere behind them, a Canadian officer with a piece of white cloth tied to a broom handle came forward at a crouch, spoke briefly with the lieutenant, and then, when the lieutenant nodded, stood up in the open and walked straight toward the door of the stone building. The Canadian officer spoke French. He spoke enough German to get across a formal surrender demand. He stopped 10 meters from the door, held up his white flag, and read out the terms. Surrender now. Come out with your hands up. You will be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Fight, and there is no reasonable chance of your survival. There was a pause of perhaps 90 seconds. Then a single rifle shot came from a second-story window and cracked past the officer's head. He held his ground for perhaps another 5 seconds. Then he walked back to the Canadian line, slowly, without turning his back on the building. The lieutenant looked at his radio operator. They tried a second time an hour later. Through a loudspeaker mounted on the Maisonneuve Battalion's regimental jeep, brought up under cover to a position 2 blocks south. The message was broadcast 3 times in German. It received no answer at all. They tried a third time at about 9 o'clock in the morning. This time, a Dutch civilian, who had volunteered to act as an intermediary, walked toward the building with a white cloth. Whether he made it to the door and was turned away, or whether he was fired upon before he reached it, the surviving accounts differ. What is certain is that he came back to the Canadian line, either injured or unwilling to try again. And what is also certain is that at that point, at 9:10 in the morning on the 15th of April, Lucu Lot 945, the Régiment de Maisonneuve stopped asking. The Canadian sergeant, crouched behind the fountain in the middle of the square, looked at the corporal beside him and said the 4 words that started what came next. Amenez le Wasp. The wasps came up along the west side of the square, hugging the walls of the buildings, keeping out of the fields of fire of the German rifles in the upper windows of the stone building. At about 9:40 in the morning, it turned at the corner and lined up on the ground floor. The commander of the carrier fired 1 long burst. Fuels splashed across the barricaded door and the ground floor windows. The building took perhaps 3 seconds to go up. Flames climbed the outer walls in ropes of orange. Black smoke poured out of the upper windows almost immediately, because the fuel drew air in from every opening. At the same time, a Sherman tank from the Fort Garry Horse, brought up specifically for this building, put a high explosive round through a 4th-story window. Then a second, then a third, Every impact was a small orange flash inside the building, followed by a puff of smoke out the window on the other side. The building burned for 45 minutes. At the end of that time, 12 German soldiers came out of the front door with their hands over their heads. Their uniforms were scorched. 2 of them were burned badly enough that they had to be carried on stretchers to the Canadian aid post within the hour. About 15 German bodies were pulled from the wreckage over the next 2 days, most of them killed by the fire, some killed by the tank rounds, 1 apparently by his own hand. Another 13 were listed as missing and presumed dead in the ruins, though the Canadian recovery teams could never account for all of them with certainty. The German major who had refused 3 offers of surrender did not come out with his men, whether he was killed by the fire, by the tank rounds, or by a bullet from his own pistol. No Canadian ever established with certainty. The Régiment de Maisonneuve did not send anyone in to look. The building was still too hot to enter for another 18 hours. By the time it was cool enough, the 12 prisoners had already been sent to the rear, and no one in the battalion had any energy left to spend on identifying the officer they had just burned out of a house. The Maisonneuve moved on across the square. By 4 in the afternoon on the 15th of April, 1945, the Grote Markt of Groningen was, in the flat language of the battalion war diary, in Canadian hands. Behind them, on the northwest corner, the building continued to smoke into the evening, and into the night, and, in some small residual sense, into the following day. Somewhere inside it, a man who could have surrendered at any point in the previous 72 hours had chosen, for reasons no one alive today can fully reconstruct, not to. That was one building. There were perhaps 15 or 20 more like it in Groningen that week. Most of them did not end that way. Most of them, in the end, put their white flags out before the flames reached them. A few did not. The men of the Régiment de Maisonneuve carried the memory of the ones that did not, home to Montreal, and mostly kept it to themselves. And then, in time, they died. And with them, the last first-hand memory of the fire on the northwest corner of the Grote Markt died too. By the middle of the morning on the 16th of April, 1945, most of the fighting inside the old city of Groningen was over. What was left was a pocket in the north, around a gasworks complex. Perhaps 500 German soldiers had concentrated there overnight, under command of officers whose names, again, have not come down with certainty. They still had ammunition. They still had food. They still had, in a purely military sense, the ability to hold out for another day or 2. They chose not to. At about 11:30 in the morning, a German officer walked out under a white flag and asked to speak to the senior Canadian officer at the scene. Terms were arranged in less than an hour. By early afternoon on the 16th of April, 1945, the last organized German resistance inside Groningen had ended. The final count, over 4 days, was almost exactly what a professional military planner would have predicted, and completely unlike what the men who fought in it will ever be able to summarize honestly to anyone who wasn't there. 43 Canadian soldiers dead, 209 wounded, about 130 German soldiers dead, roughly 5,200 taken prisoner, a figure that included pockets outside the city itself. In the surrounding countryside, where separate German units surrendered in the days after the fall of the town. And, in the streets and the cellars and the second-floor apartments of the old city, roughly 110 Dutch civilians killed. Some by German fire, some by Canadian fire, some by the fires that had swept through their buildings after a Wasp carrier had done its work 3 blocks over. Some, in the last days of a war, they had personally done nothing to start, by simply being in the wrong stairwell at the wrong moment when the war finally passed over the top of them. The Dutch civilian figure is the one that requires sitting with for a moment, because it is easy, in a story about liberation, to keep the arithmetic on the side that liberates. The Canadians lost 43. The Germans lost 130. The Canadians took over 5,000 prisoners. Those are the numbers that go on the plaque. The 110 Dutch dead do not go on the plaque. In most retellings of the fall of Groningen, they are simply not there. They are the accepted cost of a liberation that, in the strategic sense, had already been decided weeks before by other armies fighting other battles, somewhere else entirely. The people of Groningen understood this. In the days after the fighting, they came out into the streets. They swept the broken glass. They dug their neighbors out of collapsed buildings. They fed the Canadian soldiers who had done the fighting. They put flowers on the fresh Canadian graves in the improvised cemetery at the edge of town. They did not blame the Canadians for the 110 dead. They understood who had come to their city in 1940 and who had come to their city in 1945. But they also did not forget. There was a particular young woman in Groningen whose name does not appear in any English language source I have been able to find, whose small brother had been killed on the morning of the 14th of April when a Canadian shell aimed at a German machine gun position had gone through the wall of the family cellar. She spent the rest of her life into her old age holding no anger against the Canadians, she said. When asked in an interview in the 1990s that appeared in a Dutch newspaper that she did not blame them, she said the war was the war, and the Canadians had come to end it, and her small brother was one of the ones for whom it had not ended fast enough. She lit a candle for him every year on the 14th of April for the rest of her life. She did not, so far as anyone in her family knew, ever tell that story to any of her own children. She simply lit the candle. There were, on both sides of the North Sea in the years after the war, thousands of small private observances like hers that nobody outside the immediate family ever knew about. That was the shape of what the war had actually cost when you added it up on the 16th of April, 1945, and for weeks afterward. The Nederlandse Binnenlandse Strijdkrachten, the internal resistance movement, moved through the city and its surrounding villages doing work of its own. Some of that work was legitimate police work, arresting members of the NSB and the Landwacht Nederland who had spent 5 years cooperating with the German occupation. Some of it was rougher. In Groningen, as in dozens of other Dutch towns liberated that spring, small numbers of Dutch collaborators were killed by their own countrymen, outside any formal legal process, in the hours and days after the German troops surrendered. The Canadian Army did not participate in those killings. In most cases, Canadian officers, who became aware of them, did what they could to insert their own military authority between the resistance and the collaborators, to funnel prisoners through Canadian military police custody, rather than allow summary executions in the street. In some cases, they succeeded. In some cases, they were simply too late. There were, in Groningen in the last week of April, 1,945 private accounts settled inside the Dutch community that the Canadians never saw and never fully understood. That was the price of an occupation that had lasted 5 years. The Canadians could liberate the city. They could not undo what had happened inside it between the 10th of May, 1940, and the 15th of April, 1945. Nobody could. Bruce Matthews left Groningen with his division the following week and continued the advance north toward the Ems estuary. His war and the war of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division would continue for another 3 weeks. On the 5th and 6th of May, 1945, at Hotel de Wereld, in the small town of Wageningen, in the province of Gelderland, General Charles Foulkes of the 1st Canadian Corps accepted the formal surrender of all German forces in the Netherlands from General Johannes Blaskowitz. Within days, on the 8th of May, the war in Europe would officially end. Blaskowitz himself would not live long to reflect on what he had signed. He was taken into Canadian custody immediately after signing the surrender and was later charged in the post-war Nuremberg process. He died in a Nuremberg prison cell in February of 1948, before his trial reached a verdict. The circumstances of his death, ruled at the time a suicide, have been argued about by historians ever since. By the time of the German surrender in the Netherlands, Matthews would already be moving his division back toward the rear. He never made a public statement about Groningen. He never wrote a memoir. In the post-war years, when he returned to civilian life and eventually to a distinguished business career in Toronto, he was known to speak about the war only when directly asked, and even then in the flat, unemotional voice of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that words were not really adequate to the experience. He died in December of 1975, at the age of 66. His obituary in the Toronto papers mentioned his wartime service in the polite, general terms that Canadian obituaries always used for men of his generation. It did not describe, and could not have described, what any given day of that service had actually looked like from the inside. Julien Bibeau brought the Régiment de Maisonneuve home to Montreal in the late summer of 1945. He returned to civilian life. The regiment continued to exist. It continues to exist today as a reserve unit of the Canadian Forces, based in the same city it had come from. Every April, on or about the 16th, the regiment holds a small ceremony at its armory in memory of the men it lost in the fight for Groningen. The names are read. A wreath is laid. Speeches are kept short. The men who fought that fight, most of them Quebec men from working-class Montreal neighborhoods, went home and lived quiet post-war lives. Some married. Some had children. Some had grandchildren. Some of those grandchildren are now grown men and women in their own right, walking around Montreal today, without knowing, in most cases, the specific details of what their grandfathers had done in a stone building on the northwest corner of a Dutch square in the last month of the war, which is, in its own way, the point. If you walk into a bar in the east end of Montreal today and start asking questions about the Régiment de Maisonneuve, most of the regulars will not know what you are talking about. A few of the older ones might. A very few of the very old ones might remember a grandfather who had been in it. If you pushed, gently, they might tell you that grandfather had never really talked about the war, except for one or two odd stories that did not seem to lead anywhere. About a Dutch girl who had brought him a cup of milk. About a burning building in a city he could not remember the name of. About a young officer who had walked out into a square with a piece of white cloth on a broom handle and had come back with the cloth shot through. Those stories, in most cases, are all that is left. The men who lived them are gone. The wars we fought after this one produced their own veterans, with their own quiet stories. That will in their turn be all that is left of them. That is the way of these things. The city of Groningen was rebuilt. The bomb damage on the Grote Markt was repaired within a few years. The Martinikerk, which had come through the fight almost undamaged, was cleaned of soot and reopened for services. The Martinatoren still stands. It has stood since 1482. It will, in all probability, still be standing 500 years from now, long after every human being who fought in the streets around it has been forgotten by name. On the 16th of April, 1985, the city government of Groningen unveiled a small memorial in the Grote Markt to mark the 40th anniversary of its liberation. A delegation of Canadian veterans came over from Canada for the ceremony. Some of them had fought in the streets around the square in 1945. They were, most of them, in their 60s by then. Some of them wept, quietly, standing in the square in the April sunlight, looking at buildings they had last seen through the windows of a Sherman tank or over the sights of a Bren gun. The Dutch mayor thanked them, in careful English, for what they had done. None of the Canadian veterans said anything, in the record I have been able to find, about the German major on the northwest corner, or about the 12 men who had come out of a burning building with their hands over their heads, or about the 15 more who had not come out at all. That was not, in the end, what the ceremony was for. The ceremony was for the survivors on both sides, for the Dutch families who had lived through 5 years of occupation and then 4 days of urban combat and had come out the other side with a city that could be rebuilt and children who could be raised. For the Canadian families who had gotten telegrams in April of 1945 that had begun with the word regret, and whose sons had not come home. The ceremony was not for the man in the stone building. There was, in the end, nothing anyone in Groningen or in Canada could think to say about him that was going to be either honest or useful. He had made his choice. His men had died for that choice, and Dutch civilians had died in fires that had been set to get at him, and he himself had died somewhere inside a burning building without ever having to look any of them in the eye afterward. Bruce Matthews had, 40 years earlier, chosen not to flatten the city he had been sent to liberate. That decision had cost him men. It had also meant that when the smoke cleared, there was still a city there, with people in it who could rebuild. That decision was, in the long run, the most important decision made by any Canadian officer during the 4 days of the battle for Groningen. It is also the decision that gets remembered least. There is a broader point in that, if you want to take it, about how history works. The generals who win by flattening a place get remembered. The generals who win by not flattening a place get, mostly, forgotten. Their restraint does not make headlines. Their restraint does not sell books. What gets written down in the histories of a war is what got destroyed and what got built. What did not get destroyed rarely gets its own chapter. Groningen is one of the places that did not get destroyed. And Bruce Matthews, in the quiet way he lived after the war, and in the quiet way he died in a Toronto hospital, in the last week of 1975, is one of the officers who made that possible. He would probably have refused to hear it put that way. Men of his generation almost always refused to hear it put that way. They said, when pressed, that they had only been doing their duty, that any officer in their position would have made the same call, that the men under them deserved the credit, and that the men who had died deserved more credit still. He was, in the specific case of the Martentaren and the buildings around it, almost certainly wrong about that. Another divisional commander, in the same position that April might well have called in the artillery, might have called in the bombers, might have decided that saving Canadian lives was more important than saving a Dutch city that his own men had never seen before. Some of the officers around him were pushing him, quietly, to do exactly that. He said no. And the Martentaren is still standing today, more than 500 years after it was first raised, because of that no. And so are most of the buildings around the Grote Markt. And so, in a real sense, is the city itself. That is worth saying out loud, at least once, even if he never would have said it about himself. If your own father or your grandfather served with the Canadian Army in Northwest Europe in the last months of the war in Europe, in any unit, in any capacity, leave his name and his unit in the comments below. This channel keeps that record because the men who did the actual work, in the actual streets, in the actual buildings, were mostly not the men whose names ended up in the history books. They were the corporals and the privates, and the young captains, and the tired battalion commanders who took the cities back, one door at a time, and came home afterward, and did not speak of most of it again. They were the whole story, not the generals in the briefing tents, not the historians in the archives, not the men who wrote the memoirs, just the men in the streets, and that was enough.